Stéfane, thank you for joining us.
Bonjour, Caroline.
Bonjour. My French is not going to be good enough to sustain this interview in French. But historically, you've been pretty sanguine about the prospects for the Canadian economy, yet you're a little gloomy these days.
Yeah,
Walk us through what you're seeing.
Yeah, so Tom spoke to the structural potential that we have in Canada. I still believe in some upside. But, you know, I'm here to speak to the shorter term, and next year will be tough for Canada. So I'm less constructive than I usually am at this point in time.
Why do you see it being tough for the next year?
Well, we're stagnating right now, and I know you have a cool chart.
I do have a cool chart from you,
and you can see that GDP's been quite stagnant for the past few months, and I think what we're going to see this week is going to show more stagnation in the third quarter. Big difference from the U.S.
Well, your chart's speaking to how monetary policy is working. Why is that? Why has it been more effective?
Not all countries are the same in terms of transmission of monetary policy. So if you have a more levered country like we have at the consumer level in Canada, and you have mortgage duration at roughly 3 years versus Americans that can have 2 years, your transmission of monetary policy will operate faster. So for the 35%, so U.S. and Canada are quite similar. 35% of households are homeowners with mortgages. But because of mortgage duration in Canada at roughly 3 years, then transmission of monetary policy is faster. And the consumer, the household, the homeowner in Canada is being hit faster.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, what are Canadian consumers experiencing in this rate environment?
Again, the mortgage interest rate costs are up 33% over the past year. There's no precedent for that. So there was, some portion of households that were at variable rates and others that are at fixed rates. And what you're going to see in the coming year is, roughly 50% of fixed rate mortgages will be reset or renewed at a much higher rate. So the potential for a mortgage reset shock at the consumer level is higher than the U.S. For the 37% of households that are renters, both Canada and U.S., same pain. Rent inflation is surging on both sides of the border, but the homeowners in Canada being hit faster than in the U.S. Will come in the U.S.
Yes, well, but there are a lot of people with 30-year fixed rate mortgages that don't want to move right now. So,
but one thing, Caroline, for sure, like the payment shock in Canada is at the household level. In the U.S., it will be at the corporate level as these corporate debt will be reset in 2024 and 2025. So household, Canada, corporates in the U.S.
So before we go a little bit deeper, I was wondering if you could just share some high-level numbers with us. I mean, what do you see happening with GDP, inflation, and what does that mean for rates?
GDP, easy, 0%. That's for 2024.
Okay.
So if you're depressed about that, by the way, about my gloomy forecast for Canada, the federal government that just introduced a GST rebate for psychotherapy. You can take advantage of that. So, and a more difficult profit environment for corporations. So again, this is a transmission of monetary policy, so no growth. Inflation will come down, but Caroline, it's going to be tough to keep it below 3% for the long haul, given that, climate change or energy transition is inflationary by nature, right?
Yep. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. But then before we move on, rates, what's going to happen?
I should be giving you more than 200 basis points of rate cuts in Canada next year, but I can't just because inflation is stickier on some of these components that you'll show in the next few months. But one thing, you're not going to see, Canada's not just one country, it's different regions. So the transmission of monetary policy would be quite different from one province to another. So if you take inflation, if you exclude mortgage interest rate costs, Canada's the only country, by the way, that has mortgage interest rate costs in the CPI. So as the Bank of Canada raises rates, then it impacts inflation. So if you take out this mortgage interest rate cost, you can see that from one province to another, it's quite different. So at one end of the spectrum, we have monetary policy, which is extremely restrictive in Alberta, 5% real rates. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have Quebec at 1.9%. Now, what explains that? Well, in Alberta, this is a 70% homeownership rate. In Quebec, it's below 60%. So clearly, mortgage interest rate cuts will bite more from one province to another. So it's all different. But I would say nationally, it's restrictive monetary policy, but more so in Western provinces.
So, and obviously one of the key things here, as you mentioned, is housing.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you see? What do you see happening with home prices? What do you? I mean,
Yeah, you're right, Caroline. With restrictive monetary policy, home prices should be coming down. But look, they went down.
Everyone's been waiting for that for what? How many years now?
Oh my God, long time.
Yes.
Yeah. Not going to happen, in my opinion. But yeah, so home prices are stickier, and that's a conundrum for the central banks because they were assuming with higher rates that home prices would actually come down, and some people were calling for a 30% drop in home prices, like we've seen in the U.S. But it's just simply not happening.
Well, so how do you fix this problem? I mean, housing at the core of it.
Well, Tom spoke a bit about that, but I think the next slide is very, very telling. The issue that we have from a housing perspective, it's a very special year, 2022, that was, in terms of population growth. It exceeded 1 million. And there's only one precedent in Canadian history where population increased by more than 600,000 in an entire year. A very precise moment, Caroline, March 31st, 1949, at midnight, when Newfoundland joined the Federation. And you can see that on that chart. After that, and that never happened. So 1 million last year was like adding to Newfoundland an entire year, and that comes with no infrastructure. So you can understand the impact that's going to have, demand for home prices, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the big deal. And this year, by the way, run rate, another million. There's no precedent in Canadian history for a 2 million increase in population in 2 years. Think about it. That's 20 million from a U.S. perspective.
So how do you solve those structural issues? I mean, home prices that are, you know, and there seems to be very little supply. I mean, how do you actually fix for this problem and a massive surge in population, which doesn't, I mean, despite all of these problems, do you see that slowing anytime soon, or how do you see this dynamic playing out?
That's why we have Romy Bauer on the panel a little bit later on from CMHE. She's going to tell us what she sees about it. I think seriously, there's a supply-demand imbalance right now. The housing deficit that we have in this country right now is, you know, we're building one home. You know, historically, we built one home for 1.8 people that joins the working age population. Now we're at one home for 4.2 people. So we would need to build 600,000 home starts per year to accommodate the population surge. The best we've ever done as a country was maybe 370,000 home starts. So we have a massive supply issue with demand like we've never seen before. So I know Tom spoke to federal government wanting to invite 500,000 permanent immigrants, but the capacity for the economy to deal with the permanent immigrants plus students plus refugees plus temporary workers at 1 million, we're just not there. So I think we need to recalibrate on the demand side and, yes, accommodate supply.
So how do you do that? I mean, obviously lots of money in Canada, lots of money investing in real estate more broadly. I mean, why is this problem seemingly unfixable?
Well, all governments have to work together, and clearly if, the thing that also characterizes Canada is 58% of GDP is driven by only the 5 major metropolitan areas. That's more than twice the concentration in the U.S. So young, gifted immigrants will want to settle in large urban areas. So the issue that I have right now is that we're trying to find a recipe for the entire country. I think we need to focus on the 5 biggest metropolitan areas, so Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Edmonton, and Calgary, and find a solution that is custom-made to accommodate, more supply on that. So let's stop deploying that Canada-wide. Let's focus on these 5 major metropolitan areas, and we can get more traction. So more supply, but maybe demand will have to be adjusted downward. It's just 1 million. We don't have the capacity to adjust.
Yeah. I wanted to get your perspective on sort of a broader fiscal outlook and how you see that impacting the economy.
Well, there's the fiscal, but if you go to the next slide, we forgot to speak to what happens in immigration. So the thing is, from the bank, the previous one. So on the inflation side, if you want to move back one slide.
Sorry.
So just to tell you, this is the conundrum for the central bank. This is why I can't give you 200 basis points of rate cuts next year. The shelter component continues to accelerate, and that's a reflection of what's happening on the population side. So from a Bank of Canada perspective, that's an issue. But at the same time, Caroline, if there's 1 million people coming in the country, then that needs more government spending on schools, healthcare, childcare, infrastructure, generally speaking, which Tom was speaking to. But I think we have yet to grasp the full issue right now. There's a lot of government spending that will need to go along with that population growth. And from a Bank of Canada,
both at the federal and at the provincial level.
Oh yes, because the spending will be at the municipal level for everything to accommodate anything that comes along with great population. Population growth is good down the road, But at 1 million, it is a capacity constraint that pushes inflation higher. Again, there are no other countries in the OECD that are dealing with this type of population dynamic at this point in time.
So basically, very hard to get this inflation picture under control.
Keeping it below 3% is a challenge at this point in time. Hence, modest rate cuts in 2024. We do have 100 basis points of rate cuts.
So lots of spending on the issues that you just raised, but I suppose, could you fit that more broadly with sort of the broader fiscal plans and
I just wanted to talk about subsidies? You're right. I just wanted to demystify a few things. Canada's been depicted as a pariah in the industrial world in terms of subsidizing its fossil fuel industry. That's not the case. According to the IMF, we have the lowest subsidies in the world, and where the Americans and the Mexicans are increasing their subsidies, we're lowering our subsidies. So I think that's important to keep in mind, and I think we need to grasp what we have. We're very ambitious on climate change and our targets, but we have yet to find a solution to where we want the economy to be. For example, Australia embraces its resource sector. Canada's a little bit more shy on that front. And for me, that's an issue. For Canada, for example, to decide to cap fossil fuel at production would be a major handicap for potential GDP. And less potential GDP means less government revenues, and then you have this population inflows that needs to be dealt with. So I think the resource sector is one way that Canada could show the world how we do energy transition with good governance, because, by the way, the World Bank says that Canada has the best governance of any country in the world as a fossil fuel producer. This is why we could show the world. And we could use our resource sector to decommission, for example, Asia's coal-fired power plants, which would be good for the planet. So I think we need to reposition our climate targets to make sure that we're dealing with the issue facing the planet and not just Canada in the world where the supply chain has completely been altered in the past 5 years.
And then, just dovetailing back to the regional slide, the impact of these clean energy policies on different regions like Alberta, is going to be disproportionate, presumably.
You're absolutely right. And without Alberta and Saskatchewan, by the way, the CO2 carbon emissions in Canada would not have been reduced. So it's 70% of carbon reduction in Canada has been achieved by Alberta and Saskatchewan. I think there's still scope for the two provinces to do more. But there's got to be a point in time where you say, well, what do we want to do as a nation with 1 million population? Well, we need to reindustrialize. And you know what? That was not part of the government's plan in 2015, but the supply chain has been altered, and we could be massive opportunities for Canada. There's no better place to be in a world of energy and food insecurity than Canada. So the potential is there. I strongly agree with Tom, but we need to reposition our industrial policy.
So views on clean energy policies are very clear. On the industrial front, how is Bidenomics affecting Canada? And can you speak about the strategy that we've seen, in terms of the global subsidy wars, trying to attract plants? is this effective?
So big time impact on Canada. And Tom spoke to, government investments in EVs, batteries, and everything. And yes, the federal government has made a good effort recently to try to match U.S. policies, but we need to catch up because our productivity is lagging the U.S. We need to make Canada more attractive. And I think for me, AI is a potential for Canada to catch up to the U.S. And maybe we should reindustrialize in certain industries that have been shunned by other governments. For example, 98% of drugs used in Canada, legal drugs, by the way, medication, right?
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
are imported. So we used to have an industry right now, and now we have 2,000 drugs in a short supply in Canada. So this is one way and it's very polluting to do, drug production. So from my view is that we should use our energy sector, take away some of that production from other countries that use this to, using coal, bring it back to Canada and helping the nation. So there's nothing wrong with producing medication. Yes, it's polluting. Yes, it takes a lot of energy, but we need to do it. AI is extremely energy intensive, Caroline, and there are 3 centers of excellence in Canada. It's in Montreal, Toronto, and Edmonton. We need to lever this up. We're number 5 in the world in terms of AI. We should be striving to be number 3. That's been our historical position. We must not drop below number 5. Let's use this. Let's spend on that. And this is why we can catch up to the U.S. in terms of productivity.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the tech space in a second, but just coming back to the subsidies, I mean, so it sounds like you think it's a good idea for Canada to spend money to attract things like Stellantis and these plants and other things like that, or what's your view?
I think we're quite concentrated right now. There are other industries that might be less popular, but as I say, the drug industry, we used to have a big one in Canada. We need to bring some back from a national security standpoint, both from a North American standpoint. There should be more of this production coming back to Canada. More traditional manufacturing also. It's not just EV, Caroline. It's like if you're going to build more electricity capacity, well, you know, there's copper wiring and all this stuff that seems to be old industry. So I know people want the new stuff, but a lot of the old stuff needs to be done. And given our capital stock in manufacturing, I only see upside for Canada if we decide that, yes, we will reindustrialize. But yes, it's a little bit more polluting, but from a planet perspective, better to do it in Canada than the rest of the world.
With that being said, it sounds like you do think it's a good idea to spend more on this sort of the tech front in terms of Canada's position there. And can you talk about what you've seen in terms of productivity?
Yeah, well, we're not doing well.
Back to the gloomy outlook, yeah.
No, but seriously, there's an asset liability mismatch between our demographic ambitions and our capital stock, which is no higher now in manufacturing than it was in 1989 when we signed the first free trade agreement. So again, there's only upside for us in manufacturing if we decide that, yeah, we will reindustrialize the country and we have all the tools to do it and all the resources to do it. And when I talk about resources, not just natural resources, human resources. We have the capital. We don't have the capital stock, but we certainly have the labor stock and good people that are coming to our country.
So we just walked through a number of different ways the government is spending or needs to spend. I mean, where is this money going to come from? How do you see the budget working here?
Well, here's the thing. I think you have a next slide, right? Is it? Are we there? Yeah,
yes.
Good. So look at net debt Canada versus the rest of the G7. We're at 15%. We did a great job after the 1990, the Great Recession in Canada, to recapitalize our pension funds, to make sure that we have discipline on the government spending. So our deficit is one of the lowest. This is the lowest in the G7 at the general government level, right? This is all levels of government. And net debt is quite low. So there's some upside there. And to your point, Caroline, you will not compete with the rest of the G7 without some public sector involvement in industrial policy, and we have the capacity to do so. So yes, that means more government spending, but the thing about Canada, our very aggressive immigration policy, we also have the best social mobility in the OECD. So people that come to Canada have social mobility, and we have talented people that will contribute to potential GDP, and that means a higher taxpayer base. That's why we have the highest participation rate in the OECD, or labor for employment to population ratio. That's your taxpayer base, right? So if you secure your taxpayer base, then you can keep on spending. I'm not saying to run deficits for the foreseeable future. I'm just saying there's an opportunity here to do even better if we decide to be a little bit more broader in terms of our industrial policy than limiting it to certain sectors like we've done in recent months. It's just better for potential GDP growth down the road.
A little more optimistic there, you're sounding. But the dollar, the Canadian dollar, what do you see happening versus the U.S.?
Well, if we decide to come up with a policy of capping oil and gas, and like that's been floated, the idea has been floating, then you will undermine your potential GDP, and the Canadian dollar will lose 10 cents. So hopefully the federal government doesn't go there. If you think it's just your normal cycle, like my current assumption would be, well, listen. Yeah, we're going to lose 6, 7 cents on Canadian dollar. It's a cycle coming. I think it's a global cycle. There's no precedent in modern history for 500 basis points of rate hikes in the OECD countries without some impact on collateral damage and some deleveraging happening in the following year. So I think it's going to be weak growth next year, not just in Canada, globally. So yeah, Canadian dollar will go down to 142. But if we deploy some of these policies that we're speaking to, then I'm more optimistic down the road. So we go to 142, and then we can appreciate from there on.
Last question. What do you see as the risk to your forecast, to the upside and the downside? What are the key things that could change?
Again, energy transition, if it's messy, can be stagflationary. I don't think we want to go there. Now, I think we need to have policies where we have visibility on the carbon tax at the producer level anyway. If we want to abolish it at the consumer level, so be it. But producers, if you want to do carbon capture and all this, well, we need some visibility on that, so we can have a carbon tax that goes up and down all the time, because that makes it more difficult for corporations to adapt. So I'm quite optimistic that Canada can lead the world in decarbonization. We have good technology here, but we need some visibility. So you know, a little bit more, less rocky in terms of implementing energy transition. That could be my biggest risk.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your views.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.